And leaders get to spend all their time doing these things, while those of us who are being led generally have to make a living at something, and we stay busy and we're distracted and we have a lot on our plate. Leaders always have that advantage. Our leaders have it. Judah's leaders had it. It's why the Bible views leaders as shepherds, and the people who are under their leadership as the flock. And leaders get to spend all their time doing these things, while those of us who are being led generally have to make a living at something, and we stay busy and we're distracted and we have a lot on our plate. Leaders always have that advantage. Our leaders have it. Judah's leaders had it. It's why the Bible views leaders as shepherds, and the people who are under their leadership as the flock. Good morning. Actually, that was pretty good on the first try. I won't make you do that again. There is a sometimes wisdom in which the distinction between opposites is erased. For instance, how many of you are familiar with the phrase, less is more? You've heard that, right? All of us have heard it. And we know that generally, less is not the same as more. Less food is not the same as more food. Less money is not the same as more money. But occasionally, we run into a situation where we recognize this truth. Maybe if we sit and wait patiently for a little bit, rather than jumping in with both feet in all kinds of furious activity, the result will actually be greater for having had that little bit of patience to wait. Less activity, more result. It can work that way. Less is more. It's gotten to be something of a cliche, but I've been in situations where I found that to be the actual face of wisdom. Or how about this one? Silence speaks louder than words. You know who understands that? Married people. I'm not sure. Yeah, I know, I'm in trouble. It's okay. I live in trouble. I'm not sure I ever really caught on a few years back when they announced that black was the new white. How does that work? But then I quit worrying about it, because since when has fashion ever been governed by anything resembling wisdom? For the younger people present, and there are a few, if I'm not making sense yet, let's do it this way. Picture Doc Hudson saying to Lightning McQueen, sometimes if you want to go right, you have to turn left. Some of you have seen, if you haven't watched Cars, go home and watch, then you'll understand all about it. Whether this makes any sense or not perhaps remains to be seen, but we continue today in the book of Joel, and I'm sorry that my trip last week dictated a break between the first two messages, and that was how the scripture got off to this. If I had kept everything in the normal order, Bill, you would have got to read the one you liked today. So I'll try to make that up to you at some point. And I'm also sorry that a lot of people weren't able to be here for the first message. I'd like it to have some continuity, but I assume that calendar is just as terrible a tyrant for all of you as it is for me. At any rate, I cannot go back now in any detail and reset the context for the prophecy, so I encourage you either to listen to the message, and I don't know if Jordan's got the podcast up and running yet or not. He's working on that, but as soon as he does, you can do that, or in the meantime, you can see me and get a transcript if you'd like. I'll give you the short version of the context. The kingdom of Judah had had several generations of leaders that had led the people away from God, and some of them practiced horrible evil, these leaders. Some of them started well, but finished poorly. One of them tried to do good, but then failed to heed a warning from God about a defect in his own character, so that with one bad decision he poisoned and undid all the good that he had attempted. The people were not blameless. They followed their leaders, with the single exception of the public execution of Athaliah. They followed their leaders. Now, I will add that the leaders always have an advantage. The leaders get to make the law. The leaders get to set the terms of the economy. The leaders have a big part in creating the social conditions that push all the citizens one direction or another. Leaders always have that advantage. Our leaders have that advantage. The leaders of Judah had that advantage. And leaders get to spend all their time doing these things, while those of us who are being led generally have to make a living at something, and we stay busy and we're distracted and we have a lot on our plate. Leaders always have that advantage. Our leaders have it. Judah's leaders had it. It's why the Bible views leaders as shepherds, and the people who are under their leadership as the flock. It's also why the judgment of God is extra strict on leaders. And yet the people have choices. And when judgment descends, it will fall on the people as well as on the leaders. The judgment descended on Judah in the day of Joel in the form of a drought and a terrible infestation of locusts that ate every green thing in the land: wheat, barley, figs, olives, grapes, apricots, pasture for livestock, all gone. Naturally, people faced hardship, and the source of offerings for the temple service dried up. No first fruits to offer, no lambs to offer. The prophet and priest Joel tried to make something positive spiritually out of this time of enforced hunger, encouraged the people to consecrate a fast during which they would lament not only the day of judgment, but the decisions and actions that had been undertaken to lead to this day. This public sorrow and repentance was the first step that had to be taken. Joel also announced that if things did not move forward from such a moment of repentance, did not move forward in a new direction, the real day of the Lord was coming, and it would be worse than what the locust and the drought had accomplished. Joel repeats that warning as we move into the second chapter. If you read verses 2 to 11, he talks about an army that spreads over the mountaintops and blocks out the sun and scales walls like they weren't there and never deviates from its path and has no mercy at all. An army before which the land looks like the Garden of Eden, and after which the land looks like a desolate wilderness. He's talking about the locusts. But he's also letting the people know in his poetic way that the locusts are only a harbinger of another kind of army that will come and will be even worse, because locusts are not interested in enslaving people. They just eat everything and move on. The locusts never rip your wife and your daughters out of your arms and take them away to be given in concubinage to foreigners. Locusts never do that. They just eat everything and move on. The locust will not hang around to levy tribute on you and your descendants for generations to come. Not their thing. They just eat everything and move on. But when this other army gets here, Joel says, and it is coming, note the way he phrases it. The locusts have already come and done their work and been when he speaks. But he says in the first verse of chapter 2, the day of the Lord he's talking about is still to come. It is near. It's coming. And when this other army gets here, they will do much worse than the locust. Well, holy smokes. What are we supposed to do? Assuming we have already taken that first action and publicly, genuinely lamented the decisions and actions that led us to this place, assuming we have already done that. What do we do next so that there may be some chance of avoiding this terrible judgment? Funny you should ask. Joel says the second step is to spread the bad news and pray. And the praying is connected to the spreading of the bad news. The Lord's ministers are to weep between the porch and the altar and cry out to God, "Spare your people, O Lord. Spare them in your mercy and loving kindness. Spare them for the sake of your glory. Spare them as a testimony to the pagans. Spare your people, O God." Now, without giving you a big lesson in the architecture of the temple, let me just note the fact that the prayer is carried out with weeping between the porch and the altar means that it is to be loud and public. This is not something someone was to do in their closet. This is right in front of everybody with great emotional demonstration. Such a prayer is meant to be heard by the people. It is, of course, addressed to God as a prayer, but it is also to be heard by the people. It is in itself the beginning of the proclamation of the bad news. And the prayer has no impact for a people until they are made to understand exactly what it is they need to be spared from and why. The bad news must be proclaimed. And once the people have understood it, they must take up the proclamation themselves, blow a trumpet in Zion, and sound the alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. And I think to myself, well, what an incredible nuisance. I'm supposed to go out and start proclaiming bad news? I don't want to go out and preach bad news. Nobody likes bad news. Everybody hates negativity, and I don't look good in sackcloth anyway. Who preaches the bad news? I'll tell you who preaches the bad news. Fanatics. Nuts. That's who preaches the bad news. I just don't want anyone to think that I'm Diane Reedy or anything. I will apologize if I have mispronounced her name. I don't know her personally. And maybe, did everybody catch this little bit of news this last week? Yes, no? Yes, no? She's a congressional stenographer. And at the congressional vote by which the government shutdown was ended, she walked to a microphone and she started talking. She said repeatedly, "God will not be mocked." And she said repeatedly, "Our nation is a house divided. We need to make up our mind. Can't serve two masters." Now, I'm going to admit up front, I wish she had quit there. She went on to say some other things. We never were a nation under God because the Constitution was written by Freemasons and stuff. And, you know, I admit that sounds goofy and conspiratorial and whatever any of us think of her outburst, and I don't even know what all I think about it yet. The good folk of Congress knew what they thought about it. Ms. Reedy was removed by security and taken forcibly to a local hospital for a mental evaluation. Yeah, they knew what they thought. This woman's a nut. She's a fanatic. I will try to keep track of her story in the meantime. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You go around preaching the bad news and everyone thinks that you're crazy. Down the end of that road, there's a man with a jacket, the sleeves of which are too long, waiting to usher me into a padded room. Or maybe just a little spot staked out for me on the sidewalk in front of the homeless shelter where I can hold up my sign. It says, "The end is near." No thanks. Well, maybe. Jesus did kind of allow as society had not been overly kind to most of the prophets. And I don't know about Diane Reedy yet. I have some thoughts. I'll let them form as events unfold. But I wonder if a few more of us don't need to develop the willingness to risk being thought ill of. Maybe being thought of as crazy. Maybe put our day job on the line. If the opportunity arose to stand between the porch and the altar, or I guess in this case between the well of the house and the lectern, and sound the trumpet in Zion, I know we like to preach the good news. This is what I was talking to the kids about. We like to preach the good news. Jesus saves. It's so warm and fuzzy and happy. But it's predicated on the bad news. God judges sin. It's why we need to be saved. It's why Jesus did what he did. And no one can ever really receive the good news without first receiving the bad news. And as this principle is true in the matter of the universal salvation or judgment of souls for eternity, so it is true within history and the temporal judgment of nations. We might argue about under exactly what circumstances less is more, and I may never get how black can be the new white, but I can tell you this with full conviction. There comes a juncture in the life of a nation when the bad news is the good news. The people cannot be spared until the people of God are willing to stand weeping between the porch and the altar and sound a trumpet in Zion. See, you talk about opposite extremes. We have these two propositions in our mind and we think of them as polar opposites, and they are not. A, there is a God who punishes sin. B, there is a God who rewards righteousness. We think we just said two different things. We did not. In the nature of God, this is a single proposition. And Joel did not want the bad news proclaimed as any form of gloating over the soon-to-come predicament of the wicked. Verse 13, now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, relenting of evil. Read that word evil as calamity. Verse 18, then the Lord will be zealous for his land and have pity on his people. And so it goes. The bad news is the good news. God will not tolerate the situation as it stands, and we, if we are his people, should not want him to. We should want to be transformed into the kind of people who can live under his blessing. We should want our nation to be transformed into the kind of nation that can do his will, accomplish his purposes within history. And if we don't want such things, somebody please explain to me in what sense we can be called his people. I, at least, am convicted that in our time, for our country, the bad news is the good news. And we must be willing to weep between the porch and the altar and sound a trumpet in Zion. I'm preaching from the book of Joel because it outlines the proper response for a nation facing the prospect of judgment. 1, alas for the day. People of God must gather and express genuine heartfelt regret and sorrow for the decisions and actions that led to this place. 2, sound a trumpet in Zion. stand weeping between the altar and the porch. Proclaim the bad news. 3, come back next week. For now, I will tell you that nothing happens in a nation that doesn't begin in the hearts of individuals. Nothing stirs within the people of God that does not stir first within the hearts of individuals. And perhaps before we get to the question of what God's people ought to be doing in this time, we need to begin with the more basic question. Are we His people? Are we? Are we His people as a congregation? And maybe we need to be more specific than that. Am I God's man? Are you God's woman? I don't know. Do we care more about His glory than our ambition? Is it our life's aim to please Him rather than to please ourselves? Would we undertake to fulfill His commands if it cost us everything? I don't know how else you answer this question. Because if those things aren't true, I don't understand how we are His people. And it needs to begin in the hearts of us as individuals. If today you look the proposition over and you have to say to yourself, I am not God's person, not by this standard, then you have a decision to make. And know as you ponder it that the people will not be spared unless the people of God stand between the porch and the altar and sound the trumpet in Zion.
We want to take a moment to thank all of you, our listeners, for setting aside time each week for the Indian Run Christian Church broadcast on this station. You can find out more about the church with a quick visit to our website at www.christforeastcanton.com. On behalf of Pastor Terry and all the folks at Indian Run Christian Church, I pray God's blessing on you and your family.